To get us off to a good start in this tutorial, I've sort of shoved a bunch of images that could be a warm-up and a cool-down in it, to be perfectly honest with you. We've got a bit of rowing, which I personally do for both warm-up and cool-down. When I'm in the gym, we've got some sort of dynamic stretching, we've got some static stretching, and we'll go through some of these sort of notions. Now, I'm assuming for a second that you folks have got at least a reasonable understanding of warm-up and cool-down. You know what the premise is. You know roughly what's included. I'm not going to cover that here. It might be something you want to reflect on, but I'm not going to cover that here. What I am going to do is I'm going to talk initially about the benefits of a warm-up. Now, I'll come back to these images, but if I look now at the benefits of a warm-up, exactly why would we go about doing it? What is actually going to change for us? Let's start with a lovely minty green to fire us off. But the first one, obviously, is we get an up arrow, which always means increase, by the way, in body temperature. And specifically, we also get an increase in muscle temperature, also joint temperature. And I'm going to come back to that point immediately. Because we get an increase in joint temperature, we get a decrease, that's our down arrow, of course, in synovial, that's not how you spell that, synovial fluid viscosity. Okay, viscosity. Now remember that viscosity is sort of stickiness, thickness, and if that synovial fluid becomes less thick, less viscous, of course it increases that sort of malleability and mobility at the joint. So one of the things that we can also stress because of that temperature is not only the joint becomes more sort of mobile, but we get an up arrow, I've got that bit, in muscle pliability. The muscle becomes kind of looser, more pliable, more potential for kind of elastic movement, okay, and that of course can help with things like decreasing injury as well. When we look at sort of our neurological system, we also get an increase in the speed, that is an arrow, believe it or not, in the speed of nerve transmission. So even on like a technical level, even on like a skill level, this is going to start improving things because our responsiveness, the timing, the sequencing of our movements might actually improve. So again, really, really useful. We've also got an increase in heart rate. Now, you probably know already that this comes down to various neural, hormonal and intrinsic factors. But that heart rate, of course, is helping to fire the relevant nutrients, let's say, to the working muscle before we start our performance. We also get an increase, up arrow as ever, in venous return. Remind yourselves the venous return is the volume of blood returning to the right atrium. So, of course, if we get more blood in, we get more blood out. That's a greater stroke volume because of Starling's law. Well, guess what? My next point is up arrow, an increase in stroke volume. We literally eject more blood per contraction, and of course that helps us fuel aerobic respiration. We also, again, other parts of our studies, we get an effective redistribution, and I'm simply going to put of Q dot. Now, if you're not sure what Q dot is, it simply means cardiac output. It's a volume of blood leaving the heart per minute. The dot actually is per unit time per minute. Now, redistribution means, of course, we vasodilate arterioles leading to the working muscles. We vasoconstrict to other organs. Now, finally, as a summary to all of these points, super lovely point for us to finish off with up here, just about left no space. Ultimately, what we get here is we end up minimize O2 deficit. So that anaerobic work done at the start of a performance is minimized because we've got these systems sort of geared up and working. Now, we can do exactly the same with our cool down. Okay, so just to be clear, let me write this in actually. This is the benefits of a cool down. Why did I write it down in that order? Absolutely bonkers. Anyway, let's go through here. Now, I'm going to underline the key words here. We get a gradual down arrow reduction in heart rate. Now, reduction in heart rate is not the key thing. It's that it's gradual because we do a cool down. We bring it down gradually. That's the point we want to make. Furthermore, we get a gradual, guess which word I'm going to underline here, reduction in respiratory rate and depth. Now, can I stress two things here? One is that we're interested in the word gradual. That's the whole point that I'm making here. But notice that our rate of breathing decreases first gradually, and then our depth of breathing decreases. The depth of breathing decreases, not quite. It decreases second. So the rate first, then the depth. Now, obviously, you can relate that to your respiratory control sort of learning if you're interested in going into that depth. But let's leave that point here for now. We also maintain. Key word, I'm going to underline it. We maintain elevated venous return. So because we're moving, we get that skeletal muscle pump helping venous return, and the respiratory pump for that matter, back to the heart. Okay, so that's really useful. We also, notice what word I'm going to include here, we also remove lactic acid. Now you might think I'm going to underline remove, I'm going to say efficiently. So because we're still moving, we are better able to efficiently remove lactic acid. So it's really important that we stress that point. And let's finish this off. Ultimately, folks, what this does is it allows us to minimize DOMS, that soreness that can happen post-exercise 24 to 48 hours afterwards. We minimize that DOM, not prevent it, not get rid of it, but minimize it. Now, what I want to sort of finish off with, and again, I'm just going to go back to some images here. We've got here an example of some static stretching. Here we've got some examples of dynamic stretching. Now, I wouldn't refer to this as ballistic, but what we're going to do now is we're going to compare static and ballistic stretching. So first things first, especially with part of a warm-up and a cool-down, I want to think about static stretching. Remind yourself what static stretching is. It is you're working your ROM, your range of movement, with no movement once the stretch is made. Okay, so we are effectively holding a stretch. That's what we mean here. It could be, for example, that we're using a Dynaband to do this. It doesn't have to be, but there's one example of a piece of equipment we might use. And the other thing we want to say is that static stretching has no bouncing in it. No bouncing. So what we tend to find is that these are really, really common in cool downs, okay? They are done in warm-ups as well. I'm sure you guys have done them in warm-ups. Now, there are some advantages and some disadvantages to this. The first advantage to static stretching is the stretching mechanism and protocol is simple. Everyone can do it. Some better, technique can vary, obviously. And it has what we describe as a low risk of injury. Now, they're the two positives. Now, I want to introduce a term to you here. It's more for your general awareness rather than a very, very specific exam term for this course. But I want you to think about contraindication. Contraindication is any activity which has the potential to do more harm than good. Okay, now we're saying that static stretching has a low risk of injury, so it's not contraindicating. And that's a nice term you can build into your answers if you're interested. But again, can I just stress it's not a specific exam term, but it is, if you like, the industry accepted term for that. The other point I would make here is the negative point is that static stretching is not as effective as dynamic formats. Now, of course, by dynamic, we are talking about stretching which involves movement. Let me just go back to my images to show you an example. This, for example, is a dynamic stretch. This is a dynamic stretch. They're quite similar stretches, actually. So those are probably working hip flexors and extensors in these particular cases. So what we're saying here is that it doesn't produce as much ROM as a dynamic stretch. Now, with that in mind, we're going to finish this off by looking at ballistic stretching. Now, of course, ballistic stretching is by definition a form of dynamic stretching because it involves bouncing, explosion, rebound. It's all of those sorts of mechanisms. So let me just quickly describe it for you. It's fast bouncing type stretches. Okay, you can sort of think about your own examples here. It could involve swinging actions, swinging and circling the shoulders, for example, at high speed, swinging the hip, swinging the leg underneath the hip, for example. And it's all about the use of momentum, okay? So they're momentum-based stretches, and that can actually move us past the typical range of movement. Now, there are some real advantages here. First of all, we get greater flexibility. In other words, it's more effective. Okay, so why do we not sort of advocate this for everyone then? We can also say it's really good for dynamic performances. So if you're a hurdler, if you're a games player, these are really effective stretches because your performances are very movement-based, they're dynamic. But there are negatives. So first of all, in some cases, they could be considered dangerous. So what word might we use? Contraindicating. In other words, they have an up arrow risk of injury. So it could be that they're a great tendency to cause injury. And the other point, and the summary point here, is it's athletes only. We're not going to do this with 65-year-old people who've just had hip replacement surgery, right? That's not what this is for. So one other point I just want to finish off with, we generally find that static is more common in cool down. And I'm talking about dynamic in general here. We generally find that dynamic stretches, including ballistic stretches, are more common in a warm-up, although static stretches are done a lot as well. Hope that's helpful. Cheers.